I came home to a half-empty closet and divorce papers on the kitchen table. 13 years of marriage reduced to a stapled packet of demands. The house, 70% of our savings. 5 years of alimony, all written in black and white, like my life was an itemized receipt. She had left a note too. Short, sharp. You're just a teacher. You can't afford a lawyer. That was it. No explanation. No hesitation. Just laughter scribbled into sentences. My name is Michael Hayes. I'm 41 years old, a history teacher at Lincoln High. And until that night, I thought my marriage was solid. Ordinary, maybe, but steady. My wife, Emily, worked in real estate. Successful, ambitious, always moving faster than me. People used to joke we were opposites. She chased deals, I graded papers. She thrived on noise, I thrived on calm. I believed that balance held us together. I was wrong. When I read those words, you can't afford a lawyer, I didn't explode. I didn't throw the papers or break anything. I just sat in silence. Because she wasn't entirely wrong. Teachers don't exactly rake in money. She knew it. She counted on it. She thought I would fold quietly, sign where she told me, and walk away with nothing but a box of books and a chalk-stained jacket. But I've never been the folding kind. I opened my notebook, the same one I used for lesson plans, and wrote 3 words. Freeze. Track. Respond. Not in anger. In strategy. The way I teach my students about campaigns and history. How the quiet movements before battle matter more than the charge. She thought I was weak because I didn't shout. She had no idea silence is a weapon. The first thing I did was freeze every joint account. Quietly. No phone calls to her. No confrontations. Just a calm visit to the bank, documents in hand. Then I pulled out files I had kept over the years. Mortgage statements, insurance policies, tax returns. Teachers might not make much money, but we keep records. Every field trip, every receipt, every form. My life was paperwork, and suddenly, that became power. I tracked every dollar she had moved. I noticed sudden transfers, withdrawals timed just before her new listings closed. I found emails she left open on the family computer. Messages to a colleague named Ryan. Not just business. Personal. Late night. Private. I didn't slam the screen shut. I just read, memorized, stored. Quietly. By the time I responded, weeks later, she thought she had won. She had the house staged for herself. She was telling friends I'd have to crawl through the divorce, that the court would bleed me dry. She laughed at me during mediation, repeating the same line. Yeah, you're just a teacher. She thought it was a punchline. What she didn't know was that I had been building something in silence. When we walked into that courtroom, she expected me to be alone, maybe with a cheap attorney barely keeping up. Instead, when she entered and saw who stood beside me, her smile froze. That was the moment she realized the quiet man she underestimated wasn't walking into battle empty-handed. Emily underestimated me because I didn't fight back the way she expected. She thought anger meant strength, that whoever shouted loudest won. But I'd spent years in classrooms, surrounded by noise, chaos, distractions. I learned long ago that silence is power. I don't waste words. I plan. The night after finding her note, I stayed awake until dawn, not pacing, not crying, just mapping. I laid out documents across the table, piecing together a puzzle she didn't know she'd left behind. Mortgage papers, insurance forms, the deed with both our names. I traced every detail with the calm precision of a historian piecing together a forgotten war. By the time the sun came up, I had a strategy. I began with small steps. At the bank, I froze our joint account before she could drain what was left. I redirected my paycheck into a separate account she didn't know existed. Quiet moves, invisible to her. At work, I requested overtime for after-school programs. Not because I needed the extra money immediately, but because it built a paper trail of diligence. Judges notice those things. Responsibility. Stability. Teachers may not earn much, but they represent dependability. I wanted that image carved into the record. Then came the tracking. Emily lived fast and carelessly. She used our shared email for receipts, confirmations, and sign-ins. I logged in at night, finding patterns she never hid. Hotel bookings during supposed business trips. Dinners that cost more than our weekly groceries. Messages to Ryan that blurred the line between colleague and lover. I didn't slam the door shut. I copied, saved, cataloged. Evidence doesn't need anger. It needs patience. The response came through connections I never flaunted. Years ago, one of my closest friends, Mark, had left teaching to study law. We'd stayed in touch, trading holiday cards and occasional beers when time allowed. He wasn't just a lawyer now. He specialized in family law. Emily had laughed that I couldn't afford representation. She didn't realize I had someone who knew both me and the system inside out. When I called Mark, I didn't waste words. I told him I needed discretion. He asked for documents, timelines, every scrap of information. I gave him everything I'd gathered, neatly ordered in folders. He was silent for a long moment, then finally said, "This isn't just a divorce. This is strategy." That was all I needed to hear. From that point, I didn't argue with Emily anymore. When she sent gloating texts about taking the house or mocking my salary, I didn't reply. Silence unsettles people more than rage. She wanted me to beg, to lash out, to prove her superiority. Instead, she got nothing. My calm became her confusion. Weeks later, when the court date arrived, she strutted in with confidence. Dressed sharp, smiling like victory was already hers. She looked at me expecting to see defeat. Instead, she saw Mark at my side, a polished lawyer who knew every trap she'd set. Her smile faltered. That was only the beginning. Because what Emily didn't know was that I hadn't just prepared to defend myself. I had prepared to dismantle every lie she had built, one quiet move at a time. Courtrooms don't look like battlefields, but they are. The wood panels, the quiet shuffle of papers, the gavel striking. Beneath all that civility, people are fighting for their lives. Emily thought she'd already won before the first word was spoken. She walked in with that same smirk I'd seen on her note, confident the judge would see her as the hard-working professional and me as the underpaid teacher. She didn't notice how calm I was. She didn't see the weight of the folder I carried in my hands. Mark leaned toward me before the session began. His voice was low, steady, more reassurance than instruction. He told me not to flinch when accusations came, not to interrupt, not to show reaction. My role was simple: let her reveal herself. Silence would do more damage than argument. I nodded once. I was ready. Emily's opening demands sounded rehearsed. The house, 70% of our savings, 5 years of alimony. She painted herself as the engine of our marriage, the breadwinner who carried dead weight. She described me as a dreamer, a teacher clinging to ideals while she carried real responsibilities. Every sentence was sharp, cutting, practiced to draw sympathy. The judge listened without expression, but I could feel the room tilt with her words. Then Mark rose. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't perform. He laid out documents, quiet, methodical, devastating. Bank transfers showing money moved secretly into accounts I hadn't known existed until I tracked them. Hotel receipts during supposed business trips. Emails where she bragged to Ryan about how easy this divorce would be, how the teacher would walk away broke. Each piece slid across the table like a blade. I didn't look at her, not once. I just listened, steady, letting silence carve the space between us. Emily shifted in her chair, the confidence slipping from her posture. She tried to interrupt, object, deny. But Mark had already anticipated every move. He didn't argue with her. He simply presented the next proof, each one colder than the last. The judge asked me a single question. "Mr. Hayes, why did you not respond to these claims earlier?" My answer was one word: preparation. Nothing more. The judge nodded, making a note. Silence filled the room heavier than any speech could. By the end of the session, Emily's smile was gone. She kept glancing at me, waiting for anger, waiting for begging, for some sign of weakness. All she found was calm. That calm frightened her more than shouting ever could. When the gavel struck, it wasn't the final judgment yet. It was only the beginning. The court ordered financial records from both sides, a deeper review of assets, a schedule for the next hearing. Emily walked out stiff, her heels clicking faster than usual, Ryan trailing behind her like a shadow. She didn't look back. Mark closed the folder and handed it back to me. "First strike landed," he said quietly. I didn't reply. Words weren't necessary. She thought she could strip me of everything, but now she knew. This wasn't going to be easy. And that was exactly what I wanted. The days after the first hearing felt strangely calm. At school, I taught as if nothing had changed. My students debated history, unaware that I was living my own private war outside the classroom. Emily, however, was unraveling. She sent long, furious texts, demanding explanations, accusing me of betrayal. I didn't reply. Every unanswered message was a stone laid in silence. And silence weighs more than words. Mark advised me to hold steady. He said her panic was useful, that every angry outburst weakened her position. I trusted him. Instead of engaging, I focused on preparation. I spent evenings combing through years of bank statements, tax filings, even utility bills. Each detail told a story. A sudden spike in spending when she traveled. Purchases she tried to disguise under business expenses. A pattern of withdrawals that mashed weekends away. Quiet evidence. Cold evidence. One night, I logged into our shared cloud account. She had forgotten to revoke my access. Inside were photos she thought she'd hidden. Pictures with Ryan in restaurants, in hotel rooms, even in our house. She hadn't been careful. She never imagined I'd look. I didn't rage. I simply cataloged them, adding timestamps, attaching metadata. Proof doesn't shout. It whispers until the truth becomes undeniable. Meanwhile, Emily's behavior grew reckless. She tried to intimidate me during drop-offs at the house, flaunting her new life, Ryan waiting in the driveway. She wanted a reaction, any sign that her control still held. She got nothing. I'd take my things, nod once, and leave. That quiet unsettled her more than confrontation ever could. Mark later told me that judges notice demeanor. Anger looks unstable. Calm looks reliable. I wanted the judge to see exactly that. At the next hearing, Emily arrived agitated. Her lawyer spoke quickly, pressing for immediate division of assets. Mark didn't flinch. He opened another folder. This time, it was proof of her hidden accounts. Transfers traced step by step. Funds she claimed were gone suddenly exposed under her own name. The judge's eyes narrowed as the papers stacked up. Emily tried to protest, but her lawyer's hand on her arm silenced her. When we left the courtroom, Emily glared at me. She expected me to say something, to gloat, to rub it in. But I walked past her without a word. That silence cut deeper than any insult. Back home, I sat at my kitchen table, the same place where I'd first read her note. The same empty space where she thought she'd broken me. I laid out my folders, one by one. Financial records, photos, emails. Her world, mapped and contained. And for the first time, I realized something. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It wasn't about anger or even about saving money. It was about control. Emily had tried to script the story of my life, reducing me to a defeated role. Now, I was rewriting it. Slowly, quietly, without raising my voice. The war wasn't over, but the battlefield was shifting, and she was no longer the one holding the pen. Pressure changes people. Some become sharper, others crack. Emily began to crack. Her confidence, once so polished, now slipped into desperation. She called late at night, her voice sharp with anger one moment, then pleading the next. She accused me of turning the children against her, of conspiring to ruin her reputation. Each accusation fell into silence. I never raised my voice, never argued. I let her words collapse under their own weight. Mark told me to keep documenting everything. Every message, every voicemail, every attempt to provoke me. He said they weren't just emotional outbursts, they were evidence. Judges don't just look at money. They look at patterns, stability, who keeps order, and who creates chaos. I didn't need to destroy Emily. She was doing that herself. At school, I played my role as if nothing was happening. I stood before my students, teaching about ancient wars, about quiet campaigns that shifted empires. They never knew that while I spoke of strategy on the board, I was living one of my own. It gave me perspective. History repeats, but it favors those who prepare. Emily's spending habits became reckless. She tried to buy her way into a new life, vacations with Ryan, luxury furniture for the house she thought she'd keep. But every dollar she spent was another entry in the ledger I carried. Mark quietly added each piece to the file. Hidden debts, irregular withdrawals. All of it painted a picture the court couldn't ignore. The next hearing was short, but decisive. Emily's lawyer demanded temporary alimony, claiming she needed support while the case dragged on. Mark calmly laid out her recent purchases, her hidden accounts, the sudden spike in spending. The judge leaned back, unimpressed. The request was denied. Emily's face drained of color. For the first time, she realized the system wasn't bending to her story. Outside the courtroom, she tried again. Her voice rose, sharp enough to draw stares from strangers. She accused me of humiliating her, of turning the judge against her. I didn't answer. I simply walked away. My silence infuriated her more than words ever could, because silence meant control. That night, I returned home to the quiet of my empty kitchen. I reviewed the day's notes, the judge's denial, Emily's outburst. It was all fitting together. She thought the fight would be loud and messy, that her threats would break me down. Instead, every outburst became another crack in her foundation. Mark called later. He told me not to underestimate the effect of patience. She's unraveling, Michael. Keep steady. The quieter you stay, the louder her panic will sound in court. He was right. I hung up the phone and sat in silence. It didn't feel like defeat anymore. It felt like momentum, quiet momentum, building piece by piece, until even Emily would have no choice but to face the collapse of her own making. And I knew I wasn't just surviving this. I was winning. Silence is often mistaken for weakness, but in truth, it is the sharpest blade. Emily had expected me to fight, to argue, to get tangled in her noise. Instead, I stayed quiet, and that quietness became unbearable for her. Her behavior grew more reckless. She began showing up at school, unannounced, waiting by my car in the parking lot. She accused me of lying to the court, of manipulating records, of hiding money. Each time, I stood still, said nothing, and simply recorded the encounter on my phone. She didn't realize that every word she shouted became another piece of evidence. Mark was precise. He said her instability was becoming our strongest weapon. Judges don't care about insults. They care about control. Every message, every appearance, every uninvited confrontation painted her as unpredictable. My silence painted me as steady, reliable, unshaken. I didn't have to prove I was better. She was proving I was safer. Meanwhile, Ryan entered the picture more directly. He accompanied her to hearings, sitting in the back like a shadow, whispering to her when tempers rose. His presence was supposed to intimidate me. Instead, it added another layer of doubt to her case. Judges notice when someone new appears at every proceeding, someone with no legal stake, yet always present. It suggests influence. It suggests instability. At one point, Emily attempted to refinance the house in her name alone. She thought she could push the process through before the court intervened. What she hadn't expected was the quiet block I'd already filed with the county clerk. A simple notice, lodged weeks earlier, preventing any financial changes without both signatures. When her application was rejected, she exploded in anger at the bank, leaving behind a trail of complaints and threats. The report made its way into our file. Mark didn't even have to argue. The paperwork spoke louder than any words. The next court session was brief, but telling. The judge asked pointedly about her spending, about her attempts to move money, about her outbursts. Emily stumbled over her answers, her voice rising, her hands shaking. I sat silently beside Mark, answering only when spoken to, never raising my tone. Each time I gave a calm response, I could see the contrast cut deeper. Her voice cracked, mine stayed steady. Afterward, Mark leaned close as we packed our folders. She's losing ground fast. Keep your distance. Let her noise bury her. I nodded, the same quiet acknowledgement I'd given him since the start. At home, I looked at the stack of documents, the recordings, the denied refinance, the financial trail she'd tried to erase. Every move she made out of arrogance, I had already anticipated with preparation. Emily believed power came from control of money, from threats, from volume. But in that silence, I realized something deeper. Power comes from patience, from waiting until the other side burns themselves out. And she was burning faster than I ever expected. The turning point came slowly, almost quietly, but once it arrived, there was no mistaking it. Judges don't show emotion, but they do show patterns. And I could see the pattern shift. At first, Emily had the advantage. Her voice carried the story of sacrifice, of being the provider, of living with a dreamer who didn't earn enough. But that story cracked with every document Mark placed before the court, with every record of hidden accounts and reckless spending. What began as her narrative of strength was turning into a picture of deception. The judge began asking her sharper questions. Why had she tried to refinance the house alone? Why had she drained joint accounts just before filing? Why were there unexplained transfers tied to vacations that didn't align with her work calendar? Each question was a chisel against her facade. Her answers grew rushed, defensive, tangled in contradictions. I sat silent. My role was to be steady, calm, the man who had prepared instead of panicked. Each time the judge turned to me, I answered in short, clear sentences. I didn't embellish. I didn't accuse. I simply provided facts. That simplicity carried more weight than all her dramatics combined. Outside the courtroom, she tried to reclaim control. She confronted me in the hallway, accusing me of hiring investigators, of spying on her life. She demanded I admit how I had gathered so much evidence. I didn't respond. I walked past her, each step deliberate. My silence was more unnerving to her than any confession. Later, Mark told me not to worry. She's revealing more in anger than we ever could through questions. Ryan wasn't helping her either. His constant presence had become a point of curiosity. The judge asked once why he attended every session. Emily stammered that he was there for support. Mark didn't need to say a word. The implication was clear. This wasn't just a divorce. It was a replacement waiting in the wings. Judges notice such things. It paints a picture of motive, of entanglement. That week, the court ordered full financial disclosure from both sides. I had nothing to hide. My records were neat. Every paycheck accounted for. Every expense matched to bills and receipts. Emily's records, however, told another story. Sudden withdrawals. Payments to accounts with no clear owner. Purchases that didn't match her claimed income. The numbers didn't lie, and the silence between them was louder than any accusation. When the session ended, the judge's words were careful, but the meaning was unmistakable. The court found grounds to question her credibility. Temporary orders were adjusted. Joint savings were frozen under court supervision. The house was placed under hold, and all large purchases were prohibited. Emily's face went pale as the gavel struck. For the first time, she wasn't in control. I walked out without looking at her, carrying nothing but the folder under my arm. The war was no longer balanced. The scales were tipping, and she knew it. And all I had done was stay quiet. By the time the court froze her accounts and locked the house under supervision, Emily's confidence had curdled into open panic. She still tried to posture in public, arriving with Ryan, laughing too loudly in the hallways, pretending the tide hadn't turned. But I could see it, the tightness in her jaw, the way her hands trembled when new documents appeared on the judge's desk. Mark told me something I never forgot. Pressure doesn't create character, it reveals it. And Emily was revealing herself faster than I'd expected. Her messages became erratic. One night, she sent a chain of insults, calling me pathetic, a fraud, a failure. An hour later, another chain came, this time begging me to reconsider, promising we could settle without court, telling me Ryan wasn't serious, that she only wanted security. I didn't respond to either. Silence was my reply, and silence was what ate at her the most. At work, I stayed steady. My students noticed nothing different. I taught about strategies from long-dead generals, about patience in battle, about how empires collapsed not from a single strike, but from 1,000 quiet fractures. I smiled to myself, because I knew I was living proof of that lesson. Meanwhile, Mark was preparing what he called the final strike. He organized every piece of evidence into one seamless narrative. The hidden accounts, the reckless spending, the photos, the attempts to refinance, the erratic communications. He told me we wouldn't need to embellish anything. The truth itself, lined up quietly, would be enough. Emily, on the other hand, began burning herself down. Against Mark's advice, she filed complaints with the school board, accusing me of misconduct, claiming I was neglecting students due to the divorce. The board investigated. They found nothing but spotless records, high evaluations, and supportive letters from colleagues. The complaint backfired, and the report was added to our case. Another fracture in her story. She also tried to sell personal items from the house, furniture, jewelry, even artwork. But the freeze order blocked every transaction. Each attempt only strengthened the record against her. By the third block sale, the court issued a warning. Another violation, and sanctions would follow. She was cornering herself, brick by brick. Ryan's presence grew strained too. He no longer looked like the confident partner standing behind her. In court, he avoided eye contact, his posture slouched. I imagined the pressure at home, the money frozen, the lies unraveling, the image of victory dissolving. He hadn't signed up for this war. Emily had, and she was losing it. When Mark handed me the final folder, thicker than any before, he looked me in the eye. This ends soon. She'll expect you to break. Instead, you'll stay silent. Let her do the breaking. I nodded once. Emily thought she had built a fire strong enough to consume me. What she didn't realize was that the flames were hers alone, and I was just waiting, calm and quiet, until nothing was left but ashes. The final hearing arrived like the closing act of a play. Everyone knew the end was near, but only one of us understood what that ending would look like. Emily still tried to wear confidence like a mask. She walked in with her lawyer and Ryan at her side, dressed sharply, chin high. But the mask had cracks, and behind them I saw fear. Mark was calm as always. He placed the thick folder on the table, the one we had built over months of patience. Every document, every receipt, every message, every failed attempt at manipulation sat inside. It wasn't anger that filled those pages. It was proof. Quiet, undeniable proof. The judge began with questions. Why had she moved funds into hidden accounts? Why had she attempted to refinance without consent? Why had she filed false complaints against me that were disproven? Emily's answers were a mess of contradictions. She spoke quickly, raising her voice, her words spilling over themselves. Each denial led to another question. Each explanation unraveled into another inconsistency. Mark waited for his turn. When it came, he didn't deliver a speech. He simply opened the folder and began presenting the timeline. Date by date, step by step. Transfers, purchases, photos, voicemails, reports. He spoke with the patience of a teacher explaining a lesson, and the evidence spoke louder than she ever could. I stayed silent. I didn't glare at her, didn't gloat. I sat still, answering only when asked. My words were clipped, factual, stripped of emotion. I could feel the judge watching me as much as listening. Stability versus chaos. Patience versus panic. The contrast was undeniable. At one point, Emily snapped. She accused me of orchestrating everything, of tricking the system, of conspiring with Mark to destroy her life. Her voice rose until the bailiff stepped forward, cautioning her to lower it. The courtroom fell into a tense silence. I didn't move. I didn't speak. That silence weighed heavier than her screams. When the judge finally spoke, the decision was clear. The house remained mine. The savings would be divided evenly, not stripped away. Alimony was denied, citing her hidden accounts and reckless spending. Custody arrangements leaned in my favor, based on stability, documentation, and conduct throughout the process. Emily sat frozen. Her lawyer whispered frantically, but she didn't respond. Ryan stared at the floor, his presence suddenly meaningless. The gavel struck, and with it, the story she had written for herself collapsed. Mark packed the folder slowly, deliberately. As we walked out, he murmured, "It's over." I only nodded. Words weren't necessary. Outside the courthouse, Emily caught my eye for the last time. There was no smirk, no laughter, no confidence. Just disbelief. She had thought the teacher would crumble. Instead, silence had rewritten the ending. And with that, I walked away. Calm. Quiet. Finished. After the gavel fell and the courthouse emptied, silence followed me home. Not the heavy silence of loss, but the clean silence of completion. For the first time in months, I didn't sit at my kitchen table with folders spread across it. I sat with nothing but a cup of coffee and the sound of a house that was still mine. Emily tried reaching out once more in the days that followed. Her messages weren't threats anymore. They were softer, uncertain, tinged with regret. She said we could still talk, that maybe we had moved too fast, that she hadn't meant for things to go this way. I didn't reply. My silence was the answer. She had chosen her path, and I had chosen mine. At school, life slipped back into routine. I taught history, graded papers, listened to my students argue about wars long past. But beneath the surface, something had changed in me. I wasn't just teaching lessons about strategy and patience anymore. I was living proof of them. Mark and I met once more after it ended. He handed me the final paperwork, stamped and signed. He said I had been one of the calmest clients he had ever worked with. I told him that calm wasn't natural, it was discipline. He smiled and said that discipline had won me more than any argument ever could. The house felt different now. For a while, every corner carried her shadow, every room a reminder of what had nearly been taken. But slowly, the weight lifted. I repainted walls, sold furniture she had chosen, opened windows wide, and let light in. It wasn't about erasing her. It was about reclaiming space. One evening, as the sun set behind the trees, I stood on the porch and thought about the whole ordeal. Emily had believed she could strip me of everything. My house, my savings, my future. She believed the system would bend to her story, that laughter and arrogance would carry her through. But the truth is simple. Power doesn't always come from noise. Sometimes it comes from silence, from preparation, from patience. She had mocked me for being just a teacher. She never understood what that meant. Teaching isn't about shouting to be heard. It's about control and chaos, about holding steady when everything else unravels. In the end, it wasn't money or threats that carried me through. It was the quiet persistence of a man who refused to be broken. I didn't celebrate when it ended. There was no victory toast, no loud declaration of triumph. I simply lived, day by day, class by class, rebuilding a life she had tried to dismantle. Some people fight back with rage. I fought back with silence. And silence, in the end, was louder than anything she ever said. The war was over. The house was mine. The future was mine. And the quiet, finally, belonged to me. Support the channel by liking, commenting, and subscribing. I promise even more interesting stories.